Hello everyone. Please make yourself comfortable. We have a lot of stories, legendary or real, to explore tonight. And I'm going to begin right now with a German tale, the story of Dr. Johann Faust. Once upon a time, a good Christian family from the province of Weimar, in the center of Germany, had a son who grew up showing good abilities at sciences, mathematics, medicine, astronomy. He mastered them. And his curiosity also brought him to the occult, darker forms of knowledge, like sorcery, prophecy, and necromancy, a form of magic involving communication with the dead. Although he knew the Holy Scriptures and was raised a good Christian, Johann Faust, that was his name, also showed little interest for moral principles, and he had an ambition to acquire more knowledge and wealth that seemed to know no limits. As his knowledge of dark sciences progressed, Johann came to believe that in order to get always more, he needed to come into contact with the devil. And he knew how. One night, he went to a crossroads in the depth of a forest near Wittenberg, where he lived, an isolated place where no one could be foolish enough to wander at night. Under the pale light of the moon, he traced certain circles he had seen in ancient and forbidden books of spells, and he used these circles to conjure up the devil. Soon enough, a strong wind appeared and turned into a storm. The trees shook, lightning hit several times, and the devil revealed himself, looking angered. Faust was afraid, and realized he may have made a terrible mistake, but it was now too late to back down. When the devil asked him what he wanted, Faust replied that he was willing to enter into a pact. He asked to be served by the devil, and provided with any information he would request, giving him universal knowledge. The devil would never be allowed to give him any false or misleading information for the duration of this pact, which would extend for as long as he should live. The devil was quick to agree on these demands, on the condition that Faust would promise to surrender his body and soul at the expiration of 24 years, and to renounce his Christian faith. To confirm this pact, Faust would have to sign his name in his own blood. Frightened, but also excited by the promise of universal knowledge and all the success and wealth this could bring, Faust agreed. The pact was drawn up, signed, and on this night, Faust started a new life. A life filled with comfort and luxury. Everything was now within his grasp. Fancy clothing, fine wines, sumptuous food, beautiful women. All he had to do was ask the devil, who had pledged to serve him, for the duration of the pact. Faust practiced astrology, and he became the most famous astrologer in the land, because his horoscopes never failed now that he could know the future. But what gave him most satisfaction was the possibility to discover everything he wished, as he was no longer limited by earthly constraints. He was able to travel to the most distant stars, flying, or explore the depths of hell. With this knowledge, he could impress others, including his students at the University of Wittenberg, where he was a professor. And shining, obtaining this recognition he craved for, was not the least of his pleasures. But what he could not do was revoke the 24-year limit to the pact. Despite all his fame, his fortune, and the powers that he had obtained from the devil, there was no way out. With the passing of every year, every month, every day, the term of the pact approached, and more, this thought spoiled the satisfaction he initially got from the arrangement. What was initially just an unpleasant thought turned to anxiety and melancholy, an obsession that possessed him a bit more each day. What was the value of the material and immaterial treasures he had received if he couldn't enjoy them? During the last years of the pact, the folly of his past actions became obvious to him, and he spent those years in fear of what would happen. Finally, the fatal date arrived. 24 years after that night in the forest when Faust had met with the devil, the time to pay had come. Faust had spent the past few days in bed, barely able to eat, sleep, or speak. And unaware of the reason for this, thinking he was just sick, his students had assembled at his house to take care of him. Shortly after midnight, at the precise time the pact had been signed 24 years earlier, they heard shouts coming from his room that was closed from inside. At first, the shouts were terrifyingly loud, and on top of them, a storm had suddenly started around the house. Then they became weaker and weaker, until nothing could be heard. The storm ended outside, and a heavy silence fell on the house. At daybreak, the students decided to break into his room, and found nothing. The body of Johann Faust had disappeared, and who knows what had happened to his soul. This tale is from the 16th century, and since then it was readapted, modified, given different interpretations along the centuries, in Germany and abroad. This concept of a pact with evil forces in exchange for worldly rewards at the cost of a shortened life, the loss of one's soul or one's offspring, is something we tend to recognize, to be familiar with. It has been used in countless stories, and actually it didn't appear in the 16th century with the story of Faust. It has older origins. First, because the character of Faust in this legend was inspired by a real person, Johann Georg Faust, a magician and alchemist of the early 16th century, and it could also have been influenced by other characters, other real persons. And second, because this legend bears many similarities to older medieval legends and myths, like the story of Theophilus, a cleric who would also have signed such a pact with the devil. We are going to explore all this, the historical characters involved, how these legends appeared and changed, they didn't always end badly, and the persistence of this motif, this trope, the pact with the devil. So we have a lot to explore tonight. There will be history and storytelling. But before we go any further, please adjust your position and take the time to breathe normally. You can release the tension in your shoulders, and as always, this story is not going anywhere, so you can allow yourself to drift, to let go, and fall asleep. You can always return later and resume the story. The timestamps are here to help you with it, and if this is more convenient for you, you have multiple places where you can listen to my stories: Spotify, Apple Music, Amazon Music, or Deezer. Also on Patreon, where your support is always welcome. It helps keep this channel free of ad breaks for everyone, and it keeps me going. I could never thank patrons enough for their support. It does make a difference for me. You will find links to all these in the description and the first comment. I also have exciting new things coming in November. First, there will be a reboot of Lights Out Library, which consists of my stories retold in American English. It will sound markedly different from the first attempt. And there will also be the launch of the same concept in Spanish on a brand new channel and podcast. We have been preparing episodes for weeks already, in both languages, with my new partner in this project, who you will discover soon. I think she does a great job, and I'm excited to launch these two new channels. But for now, let's return to tonight's story and immerse ourselves in the Faustian legend. I told you that the fictional character of Faust had at least one predecessor, Theophilus. So let's take a look at the story of Theophilus. Theophilus was an archdeacon of Adana, a province in the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century. Archdeacon, that is to say, a high-ranking cleric just under a bishop. One day, the bishop position became vacant, and even though he had not asked for anything, Theophilus, who was very appreciated and respected, was elected as the new bishop, unanimously. But Theophilus never searched honors, and out of humility, he turned the position down. So another man was elected as a second choice and became bishop. But this new bishop resented Theophilus, whose mere existence reminded him that he had not been chosen first. So he spread rumors and acted maliciously to deprive Theophilus of his position as archdeacon. Despite never searching conflict or having bad thoughts, Theophilus' good name was dragged in the mud, and he lost his position. This was blatantly unfair, and Theophilus regretted his decision to refuse the bishop position. He turned so bitter that he contacted a necromancer that could put him in contact with the devil, with Satan. And the Dark One agreed to help Theophilus, but only if he renounced his Christian faith and the Virgin Mary in a contract signed with his own blood. Before these events, Theophilus would not even have considered it. He did not even want to be a bishop in the first place. But he had become so bitter at the unjust treatment he had received that he complied. He signed the pact. The devil gave him the position as bishop, and his good reputation was restored, as no one knew how he had obtained it. But Theophilus knew, and grew increasingly fearful for his soul. He repented, and felt genuinely sorry for signing this pact. But that was not enough to get rid of it. He began a long period of fasting and praying, and he was so sincere that after 40 days, the mother of Jesus Christ, the Virgin Mary, appeared to him. At first, not to comfort him, but to chastise him. Theophilus begged for forgiveness and told her he would do anything to turn back time or erase his sin. Mary promised to intercede with God. His fasting lasted for 30 more days, and Mary reappeared, granting him absolution. This gave him some peace of mind, as he had been forgiven for his action. But the pact was still in force, and a few days later, to his terror, he woke up and found the contract on his chest. Satan was reminding him that the poor man still belonged to him. Theophilus tried to destroy the pact, tear it down to pieces, burn it, but it was indestructible. Desperate, he went to another bishop and confessed everything he had done, from his resentment at losing his archdeacon position to his pact with Satan. After hearing his confession, which was sincere and did not shy away from the truth, the bishop took the contract and approached the candle. The pacts burned. It was finally over, and Theophilus had been delivered. Such was his joy and gratitude that he died, freed and saved. His immortal soul could rise to heaven. Did Theophilus exist as a historical character? Yes, probably. There was a bishop in Adana in the 6th century who was canonized, made a saint of the church. But this story of a pact that he is most famous for appeared after his death and is considered legendary. It could have been first spread by one of his disciples, who would have claimed to be an eyewitness to these events. But this story of the disciple may also be part of the legend. the first tangible written records of the story appeared centuries later, during the Middle Ages in the 10th century. And maybe the popularity of this particular story, which was increasingly mentioned and retold in books from the 10th to the 14th century, had to do with evolutions in theology. From the 11th century onward, in Western European Christendom, the importance of the Virgin Mary increased as a purely benevolent and comforting figure who could intercede to God to help the faithful have their prayers heard or to be forgiven. Of course, Mary was a well-known figure since the times of early Christianity, but was not necessarily often prayed to directly in the first millennium. Her importance in theology and in popular devotion grew a lot in the last centuries of the Middle Ages. Chapels were dedicated to the Virgin, cathedrals were often dedicated to her. She became very present in iconography, from paintings to sculptures, on the facades and inside medieval churches. And the Church favored and accompanied this rise in popularity that never really ended across the Catholic world. The Virgin Mary became a maternal figure, always comforting and benevolent. This is typically her role in the story of Theophilus. Her intercession saves the day, or at least saves his soul. So Theophilus was a historical character, and a legend was built upon his name. And there was also a historical Johann Faust. But who was this man? And why did a similar story of pact with the devil develop around him? The real Johann Faust was born around 1480 and died around 1540. So he lived during the very late Middle Ages and early Renaissance in Germany. It is not always easy to distinguish fact from fiction about him, because in the decades following his death, he quickly inspired stories. The first recorded ones, the written ones, are from the 1580s, about 40 years after his death. And in that respect, he reminds of another figure I told you about in a previous story, Michel de Notre Dame, Nostradamus, who also was an astrologer of the 16th century. Maybe the first name of Faust was Georg and not Johann. His birth date is also uncertain. 1480 is possible, but some scholars believe it could be earlier, around 1466, because traces of students with similar names were found in city and university archives in different places, like Ingolstadt in Bavaria or Heidelberg in Baden-Württemberg. Little is known about his early life. For the same reason as for Nostradamus, these were not important people. They were not from aristocratic or prominent families, and at the time, there were no systematic recordings of people, of ordinary individuals. They only appeared punctually in the records of a particular school or an university when they studied there, or in church records when they were baptized, when they got married or buried, sometimes courts of justice if they got in trouble or testified, but many of these records were lost, and it is difficult to track the early years of such people. But what is established is that starting in the years 1500, so he was aged somewhere between 20 and 40 at the time, he had an itinerant kind of life in the south and center of Germany. His presence was recorded in various cities. In 1506 in a town near Frankfurt, and over 3 decades in Würzburg, Heidelberg, Bamberg, Ingolstadt, and more places, where he apparently lived from performing magical tricks, establishing horoscopes, and also scamming people of their money. Sometimes he presented himself as a physician or a doctor of philosophy, other times as an alchemist, an astrologer. And more than once he was denounced as a fraud and occasionally banished from several of these cities. In 1528 he was banished from Ingolstadt, and in 1532 he was denied entry in Nuremberg because of his reputation. Reports about him can be conflicting. Oftentimes he was denounced as a fraud, a few times as a sodomite, a grave accusation of homosexuality at the time. He was also suspected of having turned to Protestantism, which was another serious accusation of heresy, because the regions of Germany where he lived had remained predominantly Catholic, and the spreading of the Reformed faith was fracturing society at the time. We don't know if he converted to Protestantism, or had any real faith for that matter, or if he really enjoyed too much the company of young male students when he posed as a professor. These could be accusations thrown at him to discredit him. What is obvious is that he was a kind of outcast, but probably not a very honest one, and he had some talent of persuasion. He managed several times to establish himself in a new city and find his way to local bishops, to universities, wealthy people that he could get employment from. And the portrait is not all negative. Other records, especially in the 1530s, speak of him in good terms. For example, he was recognized as a respectable astrologer by a distinguished scholar, Joachim Camerarius, one of the most prominent intellectuals of the time in Germany. A well-known and well-established physician also praised his medical knowledge. So either he was completely misunderstood, but the quantity of fraud accusations from multiple places and people over 30 years make this a bit hard to believe, or he was a very talented scammer, or maybe over time he had acquired real knowledge. It is hard to tell. Johann Faust remains an ambiguous figure, one that is hard to reduce to an itinerant scammer. His death is dated to 1540 or 1541, and here again the circumstances are uncertain. According to some accounts, he would have died in an explosion during an alchemical experiment. Certainly because he had lived a very uncommon life, and people remembered him in the regions of Germany he had traveled. Rumors were quick to appear about him in the decades following his death. Rumors like, for example, that he traveled with a horse and a dog, and sometimes the dog would transform into a servant. Magical texts or books of spells attributed to him also appeared on the market. But there is no evidence he was their author. They could have been published with his name on them just to sell them, using his little local fame. What really made him famous, and beyond the south of Germany, was the publication in 1587 of a chapbook, that is to say, a booklet of a few pages, that contained stories about Dr. Johann Faust, the fiction character. I took the story I told you at the beginning from it. This booklet was a big success, and it established the Legend of Faust in Germany and soon abroad, because it became the main source of other works. An important one that brought Faust to English-speaking audiences was a play, a tragedy, called The Tragical History of the Life and Death of Dr. Faustus, or just Dr. Faustus. It was created by Christopher Marlowe, a major playwright and poet from the Elizabethan era in England. He wrote Dr. Faustus in 1592 or 93, only 5 years after the publication of the German chapbook. And this was how Faust quickly became an international fiction character. The English audience was certainly drawn to the bit of exotism that came with it, but the main topic of the story, the pact with the devil, was not a complete discovery for the English and other people. I told you about Theophilus before, and we will see that there were other stories of the same kind already. The relatively educated audience of the theatre at the time knew all this. And later, the 1587 chapbook also became the main source of another retelling of the Faust legend, the most famous retelling, the work of German poet Goethe, Johann Wolfgang von Goethe, a play in 2 parts just called Faust, and this play was written more than 200 years after the chapbook. It includes many more details and characters than the original story. Goethe took his work far beyond the relatively simple storyline of the popular legend. In the first part of the play, the focus is on the soul of Faust, sold to the devil, but in the second part, he blends mystical and philosophical topics with considerations on psychology and even history and politics. This makes his adaptation of Faust a very rich, complex, and brilliantly written work that many consider to be one of the greatest works of German literature. The 2 parts of the play are very long and have rarely been adapted together. But this work was very influential, and internationally, writers and translators from the Romantic era in the first half of the 19th century acknowledged it quickly. Phrases like Faustian pact appeared in different languages, not necessarily to qualify literal pacts with the devil, but in a figurative sense. A Faustian pact is when you abandon your principles, when you agree to do something morally wrong, against material advantages, and implicitly there is the idea that one day serious consequences will appear. after you have enjoyed the pleasant part of the deal. An element that can explain the persistence of the myth of Faust is that it can be looked at from very different angles. Superficially, it looks like a choice between good and evil, or between virtue and sin, like in the story of Theophilus. But it can also be the starting point of a psychological or even philosophical examination. Does one prefer the short or the long term? Is a good life one that is shorter and easier or more intense, or a life that is longer and possibly more difficult too? Is it possible to enjoy the present knowing that death is inevitable, waiting for us at the end of the road? We cannot listen to the legend of Faust without asking ourselves what we would do in his place. And the answer can contribute to define what kind of life we want to have, what kind of person we want to be. These are questionings that any generation can relate to, whatever the time period, but in particular Romantic authors of the 19th century, when the work of Goethe was published. They never missed an opportunity to examine the meaning of their lives. On a more superficial level, Faust is also a character that evokes times of magic, mysteries. There's a touch of Gothic that comes with it. Gothic in the sense of the literary genre. Plenty of things that made him a compelling character in the 19th and 20th centuries. I told you earlier that Faust was the most famous version of this concept, this motif of the deal with the devil. We saw that Theophilus was an older example. So what other relevant examples of similar stories do we have? There are actually many, some of them appearing after the deaths of famous people, and others in cases of witchcraft trials, were accusations that took people to their death, despite their denegations. Examples of posthumous rumors of a pact with the devil even include a pope, Sylvester II, who was pope for 4 years at the turn of the millennium, between the years 999 and 1003. How did this happen? The birth name of Sylvester II was Gerbert of Aurillac. He came from Aquitaine in the southwest of France. And before his career in the church, he became a scholar and a teacher, probably one of the most cultured minds of his time, because he studied intensively mathematics and astronomy, not just based on the few preserved Latin and Greek texts that were available in Europe at the end of the 10th century. He also studied in Spain and gained access to the works of Arab scholars who had taken in more of this antique science and pushed it farther. At the time of his stay, a big part of Spain and Portugal were still under Muslim rule, and he became one of these Christian scholars. There were others too, who drew inspiration from Islamic texts, and through them rediscovered a large part of the Greek and Latin legacy that had been forgotten in Christendom. For example, Gerbert contributed to reintroduce the abacus in Western Europe, the counting frame, which was widely used in ancient times, but had disappeared in this part of the world. Or the armillary sphere, a spherical type of astrolabe that had also been lost to Latin Europe since the end of the Greco-Roman era. He also advocated for the introduction of the decimal numeral system using Arab numerals, the system of numbers we still use today, with figures going from 0 to 9, and any number being a combination of them. Prior to this, Latin and Western Europe still used Latin numbers. In 969, age 23, he participated in a pilgrimage to Rome. His education was noted there by the Pope of the time, John XIII, and he became a tutor to the son of the Frankish emperor. And from there, he began a high-level career as a teacher and cleric. He became an abbot, an archbishop, and in 999 he was elected pope, which he remained until his death 4 years later. But why the rumors of an unholy pact with the devil? Sylvester II had humble social origins. They are not very well known, but he was not a noble nor rich. So his rise, his social rise, was very spectacular. But still, the rumors, the legend surrounding him only started a century later. It grew from the writings of an English monk, William of Malmesbury, and from the pamphlet of a cardinal also written decades after the death of Sylvester II, at a moment when the papacy was being disputed between different parties. Sylvester had studied Islamic documents in Spain. That was a bit suspicious. He was familiar with complicated things and concepts such as armillary spheres. He had had this spectacular social rise. This made him a strange character for a pope. And so in their writings, they claimed that his success was the result of a pact with evil. More precisely, with a female demon called Meridiana by William of Malmesbury, who would have appeared to him after he had been rejected by his earthly love. Meridiana would have concluded a pact with him, and with her help, he would have ascended in a few years from obscure and forgettable teacher to friend of the rich and powerful, to abbot, to archbishop, and finally pope. This legend was never taken very seriously, either by ulterior historians or by the church, but since then it has remained attached to the figure of Sylvester II. Another occurrence of a post-mortem legend like this appeared in Icelandic folklore, with a character called Saemundr Sigfússon, a priest and scholar from the 11th and 12th century, who lived in Iceland. Once again, this was a real historical character, who probably studied away from Iceland, possibly in France or in Germany, and later returned to his country of birth. And over time, he became a legendary, larger-than-life type of character, with many stories, and in particular stories in which he tricks the devil into doing his bidding. For example, in one story, he made a pact with the devil because he needed to return to Iceland from Europe. The devil would take the shape of a seal and carry him, but on arrival, he hit the seal on the head with a Bible and stepped ashore. This was not the only time Sigfússon escaped the devil. In other tales, he studied at a school in Rome, the Black School, where there were no schoolmasters nor professors. Every time the students required information on the dark arts of magic, which was what people learned in the Black School, books about the subject were mysteriously provided on the following day, or information was mysteriously written on the walls. The Black School did in fact belong to the devil, and studying there was dangerous, because at the end of a year, when the students left the school, the devil would keep the last one remaining. So the students had to leave all at once, all at the same time, or choose the poor guy who would have to stay while they escaped. The lot fell on Sigfússon several times, and so he was trapped in the school. But he always managed to deal with the devil. For example, once, he challenged the devil to find him in the school. He would hide, and if the devil had not found him after 3 days, he would be free to go. The devil agreed, but could not find him, and so Sigfússon could escape safely. Another time, as the students were all leaving the school, and Sigfússon was running behind them, meaning he would be caught, he sewed a leg of mutton into his cloak, just where his arm would normally be, and he kept his real arms stuck to his body. When he arrived near the exit, still running, the devil reached up to grab his cloak, but only grabbed the leg. Saemundr dropped the cloak and went through the doors to safety, leaving behind the devil with just an empty cloak and a mutton leg. These stories were told in Iceland centuries after the death of the real historical Saemundr Sigfússon, and you see that they are a bit farcical. The devil appears like a fool in them, which also illustrates that deals with the devil could be treated in a much lighter way than in the cases of Theophilus or Faust. Sylvester II and Saemundr Sigfússon are just 2 examples of a mostly fictional approach. But there were also occurrences that were way more tragic, when real people were accused of having signed pacts with the devil, and sometimes were executed for this. These accusations were regularly invoked in witchcraft trials of the early modern period, from the very end of the Middle Ages, the 15th century, to the late 17th century. The last major witch hunt, arguably the Salem witch trials, happened in the year 1690, at a time when such trials had already ended in Europe. But before, in the 16th and 17th centuries, accusations of dealings with demons that would offer supernatural powers to people in exchange for their souls or sacrifices were not uncommon. In every single case, it appears that behind these accusations there were feuds, revenges, jealousy, conflicts on property, local politics, and these accusations also often fell on outcasts or people who were different, who didn't live like the rest of their community, either because they lived in isolation or did not show enough zeal to go to the church or participate in the life of their community. I told you about the Salem witch trials in a previous story. So tonight, we're going to take a look at a lesser known, but no less spectacular witch trial that happened in France in 1634, almost 60 years before Salem, the affair of the Loudun Possessions. Loudun is a town in Poitou in the west of France, and at the time of these events it had a few thousand inhabitants, with significant Catholic and Protestant communities. In the years 1630, wars of religion in France had been over for a generation already, and there were no longer major violence. But it doesn't mean all tension had disappeared. The wars of religion had ended on a kind of compromise. The kings would be Catholic, and Roman Catholicism would remain the religion of the kingdom, but Protestants would be tolerated and have the right to practice their faith freely. This compromise had been in place for some time already, but Protestant communities still were a bit suspicious of the king's authority and decisions. During the wars of religion, during the previous century, entire towns and cities had been controlled by the Protestants, and many of them still had, at the time, the fortifications erected during the Middle Ages. These fortifications had been used for their defense, but now that the Civil War was over, and France was restoring its economy and a degree of internal tranquility, the king was reaffirming his power. This king was Louis XIII, the 13th, and his chief minister was Cardinal Richelieu, an important statesman in the history of France, who worked to reinforce the power of the crown and centralize the state, as well as secure French influence in Europe, for example by intervening in the 30 Years' War that devastated Germany at the time. A fictional version of Richelieu is famous as the villain in the Three Musketeers novel, but he was indeed a very relevant and influential minister who contributed to pave the way to the comeback of France as a major power in the 17th century. So, at the time, the crown, Louis XIII and Richelieu, acted to centralize the kingdom, to erase the remaining traces of feudality, and one aspect of this policy was to dismantle fortifications in cities that were far away from the frontiers, especially cities with a large Protestant community, because some of them had revolted and using these fortifications had defied the king's power during the wars of religion. Loudun was one of these towns with fortifications and Protestants. It was hundreds of miles away from a frontier, but other towns in the west of France were also affected, and they had their defenses taken down, which made sense in an unified modern state, but didn't go without resistance, especially from Protestant communities, obviously, that felt more exposed without these defenses, especially when they were eliminated by a Catholic king that they did not fully trust. The Catholics generally supported the crown, but not all of them were in favor of taking down fortifications, because it also gave them a degree of security. What if the state did not protect them? In that case, it would be good to still have local defenses. So the dispute around the fortifications, and more broadly around the state imposing its direct rule on this province, made the atmosphere in Loudun electric in the 1630s. And on top of that, in 1632, a plague hit Loudun, and it claimed many lives. Rich people who had the means took their distance. They moved to other places to safely wait for the end of the outbreak. These two events combined plunged the city in a state of anxiety, of apprehension, of underlying hostility between religious communities or between rich and poor. And it was in this context that the affair began. One of the Catholic priests in Loudun had an unusual profile. His name was Urbain Grandier, and since he had arrived in town, he had acquired the reputation of a womanizer. He was considered to be a good-looking man, wealthy, well-educated, and charming enough to gain a lot of attention from different wives of the town's good society. It seems to have been an open secret in Loudun that he had slept with many of them and fathered at least one son. And this behavior had made him a lot of enemies. Enemies like husbands, fathers, and even other clerics or monks who envied the large attendance he drew to his parish. Obviously, this looked morally wrong to everyone, but priests having relationships was not something that extraordinary. The church was also a career, often followed by the second or third sons of well-to-do families. The firstborn son often inherited the family titles and business when there was one. So many young men had to look for other career options, and they could pick this one even without having a strong vocation. What was less ordinary about Urbain Grandier was that he seemed to make very little effort to hide. He would barely deny the facts when confronted, and he kept acting as he pleased. This ended putting him in trouble around 1629, when he was denounced to his bishop and banned to perform any public functions as a priest in Loudun. But he appealed and had the punishment lifted. So it went on. Grandier had another originality. He was Catholic, but he opposed Richelieu's policy of dismantling Loudun's fortifications. So in that, he went against the position of many Catholics. And as for the rest, he didn't bother to hide his opinions. He was vocal about them. To any observer, this looked like a very dangerous attitude, speaking against the crown's policy, alienating the Catholics while being a Catholic priest, and on top of that with a sketchy reputation. That was very imprudent. But it seems Grandier could not help it, possibly out of an excess of self-confidence, bordering on hubris, or maybe he was oblivious to the danger. but for several years he maintained the same conduct. So that was rather scandalous, but we were still far from witchcraft or deals with the devil at this point. The real affair that involved Grandier and cost him his life started in 1632. There was a convent in Loudun, a convent with 17 nuns, 25-year-old in average. With the outbreak of plague that I mentioned before, the convent had completely shut its doors. It no longer received visitors at the parlor, and the nuns spent several months in complete isolation. One day, one of them said she had had a vision of her recently dead confessor, and soon other nuns reported similar visions. Was it the effects of isolation and a kind of contagion, or something else? In any case, this kept escalating, to the point that almost all the nuns soon claimed that them too had visions, and their nature became increasingly worrying. They started reporting that a demon visited them to commit indecent acts at night, in the secret of their cells. An exorcism was considered, and the young women were interrogated about the evil spirit that was thought to be possessing them, and what or who had caused it. They gave different answers to that last question, citing different people, including an unspecified priest. Finally, months after the possessions had begun, and now that the convent was in a state of chaos, the name of Urbain Grandier as the cause of this demonic invasion was given. At this point, chaos was not an exaggeration to describe what was happening behind the walls of the convent. What had started as nightly visions had spiraled out of control. At times the nuns barely acted human anymore. They shouted, swore, barked. Some had fits of convulsions. This was so extreme that visitors were drawn to the convent out of curiosity. Physicians or exorcists at first, and then increasingly just visitors, curious people who wanted to see the show. Opinions were split about what was happening. Some thought real possessions were taking place, and the convent was cursed, but others, including many clerics, saw this as an imposture to draw attention or a kind of collective madness, even though the term did not exist at the time. People were now traveling to Loudun from afar, including from England or Germany. They wrote about their visit and what they had witnessed there. And so this bizarre case started to become embarrassing for authorities, including the court in Paris, where the situation in Loudun was now a topic of conversation. Richelieu understood immediately it was a touchy situation, because at the same time, he was trying to have the fortifications destroyed, and he faced resistance. An envoy had been sent to order the demolition of the town's tower, but he had been prevented from doing so by the town's militia. Returning to Paris, this envoy explained what was happening in Loudun and reported on the possessions, the resistance to the crown's authority, and also the odd case of this Urbain Grandier, this priest who openly defied good Christian values and spoke against the cardinal. That was a lot for a single town, and an investigation was decided, starting 18 months after the beginning of the possessions epidemic at the convent. Grandier was arrested immediately as a precaution against his fleeing the area, as a person of interest since his name had been given by the nuns, even though he knew none of them, and it could never be proven that he had ever entered inside the convent. Grandier's only known connection with this convent was that the Mother Superior had offered him the position of spiritual director, which he had turned down. Over several months, the investigation took place, followed by a trial. A trial because during the investigation, the priest had been accused of all kinds of indecencies, some of them probably true, by the numerous enemies he had in town. The investigators believed that the possessions were an imposture. At this time in France, witchcraft trials were really old-fashioned. They had already started to be questioned, and people would think twice before believing these stories of witchcraft or dealings with demons. The investigators had noticed that the anecdotes given by the nuns and their behaviors seemed contagious. When one said or did something publicly, others quickly replicated it. But when they were kept separated, unable to communicate, none of this contagion happened. Not necessarily that the young women were consciously putting on a show, it seems to have been more a case of group hysteria. But when the report of the investigation was sent to Paris, the parts that described the possessions as fake mysteriously disappeared. These conclusions, that there were no real possessions at the convent, were eliminated. And many believe this was a political decision, possibly taken by Richelieu himself. He needed to crush opposition in Loudun. He needed someone to be guilty. And Grandier had the perfect profile for this. The perfect profile because of his life of debauchery, and maybe more importantly, his opposition to Richelieu's policies. Grandier was taken out of his cell and brought to his parish, where an exorcism of the nuns was to be performed. Grandier himself was asked to perform it in his quality of priest, and he did. At the convent, the episodes of fits and the reports of visions had receded a little bit, but not stopped. In August 1634, Grandier was accused of being responsible for this crisis. He would have made a pact with the devil and brought these demonic possessions to Loudun, either by letting the devil in or by sending demons to the convent. There was absolutely no hard evidence of anything connecting him to the nuns, only witnesses of morality who had described him as a bad Christian and an even worse priest, and claims by some of the nuns that he was responsible, even though they had never met him. The accusations file was light, and only a case of pact with the devil could give it an apparent sense and connect Grandier with this convent. But witnesses of this trial, participants and Grandier himself, were not fooled. They all knew that his guilt had been decided for political reasons. Richelieu wanted him dead, and wanted to make an example with him for anyone who would dare speak against him and the crown. Grandier had few friends and many enemies, way more powerful than his supporters. And so he was found guilty and condemned to be burnt at the stake, which was done shortly after the sentence was pronounced. He was executed for dealings with the devil as the main count in August 1634, aged 43 or 44. Contrary to what some may have expected, possessions failed to stop at the convent after this execution. They lasted for 3 more years until 1637. It was not written publicly immediately, because this would have been dangerous, but many contemporary observers of this case of possession thought that it was Richelieu who had piloted the trial and the sentence unofficially. He certainly had the power to do it, and this would not be surprising given his general course of action. There is no irrefutable proof that it was the case, but it sounds very likely. Posterior commenters all considered it to be a political trial disguised as a witchcraft trial, and that Grandier was chosen as a scapegoat, or brought it on him with his reckless behavior. Few people took the possessions seriously, but still, something had happened at the convent. Even if it was a case of collective madness, they rarely last 5 years and become almost a tourist attraction for visitors who come to see the crazy nuns. Maybe it could have been pranks played on the nuns by making noises at night, or surprising them in their sleep with costumes. That's a possibility, but it is completely unproven. A psychological explanation that was proposed much later in the 19th century was that of a mental disorder due to the very particular context. They lived in a town with this political and religious conflict. There was this plague outside the closed walls of their convent. They received no visits for several months before the possessions began. So they basically lived as prisoners in isolation. They were mostly young women who had not seen much of the world before arriving there. In average, they were 25-year-old. And of course, the rules of life in the convent were relatively strict. These were as many elements that may have brought them dangerously close to insanity and made them unable to distinguish reality from fantasies. Maybe these fits and alleged possessions became a way for them to express their fears, their concerns, their ideas, in the voice of another, because the place where they lived, the circumstances, and the rules they were subjected to did not allow them to communicate, to exteriorize any other way. Maybe. A theory that was exposed in particular by Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, he also wrote about the Loudun Possessions. So the theory is that the accusation of Grandier was also retaliation from the Mother Superior of the convent, Sister Jeanne of the Angels. I told you before she had offered him the position of spiritual director, which in itself is surprising with the reputation he had. Letting him inside a convent with 17 nuns in their 20s, this sounds a lot like letting the fox among the chickens. So why did she do that? Possibly because she had become obsessed with him, having heard of his reputation or seen him, and she wanted to establish a connection. His rejection could have enraged her, and she could have been the one who ensured that his name surfaced during the exorcisms and the investigation. An element that could give credibility to this hypothesis is that after he rejected the position, she hired another cleric, who was also one of Grandier's worst enemies. Later, during the investigation, he accused Grandier enthusiastically. But this is all theoretical and circumstantial. We don't know enough about the Mother Superior's character to conclude anything. It is likely that behind the walls of the convent, in the secret of Richelieu's office, or in the bed of Grandier, many other things happened that left no traces and keep a part of mystery to this affair. We have reached the end of our journey for tonight. You can now let go and fall asleep, or if you don't feel sleepy, pick another story from my library. I'll be back soon with another one, and in the meantime, sleep well, sweet dreams, au revoir.